On the cold evening of December 25, 1991, in the heart of Moscow, a moment unfolded that would echo through history. The iconic red Soviet flag, emblazoned with its unmistakable hammer and sickle, was slowly and solemnly lowered from the Kremlin's highest tower for the very last time. For nearly 70 years, this flag had flown as a symbol of communist power, revolution, and the Soviet dream. Now, as it descended, it marked the end of an era that had shaped the lives of millions and the fate of nations across the globe. In its place, the Russian tricolor, white, blue, and red, was quietly raised, fluttering in the winter air. This simple act, witnessed by only a handful of people in Red Square but broadcast around the world, quietly signaled the official dissolution of the USSR. The Soviet Union, once a vast and powerful superstate, had ceased to exist. Not with a dramatic battle but with a silent symbolic gesture. The world watched in awe and disbelief. The Soviet Union, which had once stood as a formidable rival to the United States and dominated half of Europe, was gone. Its collapse was not the result of foreign invasion or military defeat, but rather the outcome of years of internal decay, economic stagnation, and political upheaval. The streets of Moscow, once bustling with parades and demonstrations, now seemed eerily quiet, as if holding their breath for what would come next. For decades, the world had been split by the Cold War, a tense standoff between the USSR and the United States. This rivalry shaped global politics, fueled an arms race, and divided families and nations. The fall of the Soviet flag was more than just a change of banners. It was the symbolic end of a global conflict that had defined the 20th century. The lowering of the Soviet flag was a moment heavy with emotion. It symbolized the collapse of a political experiment that had begun with the promise of equality and justice, but ended in disillusionment and hardship. For some, it was a moment of relief and hope. For others, it was a time of mourning and loss. For millions of ordinary people, this moment brought a confusing mix of hope and anxiety. There was hope for new freedoms, for democracy, and for a better life. But there was also deep fear. Fear of the unknown, of economic chaos, and of what the future might hold without the stability, however imperfect, that the Soviet system had provided. The stability that had been enforced for decades was suddenly gone. Government buildings stood empty, factories were abandoned, and the streets felt deserted. The old order had vanished almost overnight, leaving a vacuum that would take years to fill. The fall of the Soviet Union was not the result of a single dramatic event or the actions of one leader. It was the culmination of deep, long-standing problems: economic mismanagement, political repression, and a growing disconnect between the government and its people. The signs had been there for years: crumbling infrastructure, empty store shelves, and growing unrest in the streets. For decades, the Soviet leadership tried to hide these cracks behind grand parades, powerful propaganda, and displays of military might. But beneath the surface, the foundation was slowly eroding, weakened by corruption, inefficiency, and a lack of genuine reform. To truly understand how the Soviet flag came down, we must look back to the very beginning, to the revolution that gave birth to the USSR, the ideals that held it together, and the forces that ultimately tore it apart. Only by tracing its rise can we fully grasp the reasons for its fall. This is the story of the Soviet Union, a story of ambition and struggle, of hope and disappointment, of rise and collapse. It is a story that shaped the modern world and continues to influence us today. Let's go back to the beginning, to the days of revolution and the birth of a new world power. The story of the Soviet Union begins in 1917, a year that changed the course of history. Amidst the chaos of World War I and widespread social unrest, the Bolsheviks, a revolutionary group led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power from the crumbling Russian monarchy. Their bold takeover marked the start of a new era, as they promised to create a society free from oppression and inequality. The Bolsheviks envisioned a communist state where the government would own all land, factories, and resources on behalf of the workers. Their goal was to eliminate class divisions and create a society where everyone contributed and benefited equally. Early Soviet propaganda depicted workers as heroes, building a new future together in communal factories and collective farms. In 1922, after years of civil war and turmoil, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was officially established. This new federation united Russia with neighboring territories, bringing together a vast and diverse population under one government. The red flag became a symbol of unity and revolutionary change. When Joseph Stalin rose to power, he pushed the country to industrialize at a breakneck pace. Massive factories and infrastructure projects transformed the landscape, but this progress came at a terrible human cost. Millions were sent to forced labor camps, known as gulags, and countless others suffered from purges, famine, and political repression. Despite the harsh realities at home, the USSR emerged as a global superpower after World War II. The Red Army played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany, and Soviet influence spread across Eastern Europe. Victory parades in Moscow celebrated not just military triumph, but the USSR's new status on the world stage. The post-war years saw the rise of the Cold War, a tense rivalry with the United States. This competition fueled an arms race and a dramatic race to space. The Soviets shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, and sending Yuri Gagarin, the first human, into orbit, milestones that inspired pride and awe. On the surface, the USSR projected an image of strength, unity, and progress. Military parades, grand architecture, and bustling cities suggested a nation on the rise. Yet, beneath this facade, deep problems were beginning to emerge. The government's strict control over every aspect of life, combined with an inefficient, centrally planned economy, led to shortages, stagnation, and growing discontent. Long bread lines and empty store shelves became common sights, foreshadowing the challenges that would eventually bring the Soviet experiment to an end. The Soviet economy was plagued by inefficiency and shortages, as central planners struggled to meet people's real needs. Citizens waited in long lines for basic goods, while the state poured resources into the military instead of improving daily life. The Communist Party controlled all information, and dissent was harshly punished by secret police. This climate of fear stifled innovation and hid the country's problems. The USSR was a patchwork of 15 republics, each with its own identity, held together by force. Nationalist resentment simmered beneath the surface, especially in places like the Baltics. The arms race with the US drained resources, worsening living conditions. Over time, people began to question whether the sacrifices were worth it. The stage was set for change. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became leader and launched two bold reforms: perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. Perestroika aimed to fix the economy by introducing limited market reforms and loosening central control. Glasnost allowed more freedom of speech and press, exposing government failures and past crimes. These changes unleashed pent-up frustrations and demands for more freedom. Instead of saving the USSR, the reforms revealed its deep weaknesses. Nationalist movements gained momentum as people learned the truth about their history and leaders. Economic chaos and shortages worsened as the old system broke down. Gorbachev hoped to reform communism, but instead he lost control. The Soviet Union was unraveling faster than anyone expected. The forces he unleashed could not be contained. Two disasters further eroded trust in the Soviet government: the war in Afghanistan and the Chernobyl nuclear accident. The Afghan War, begun in 1979, dragged on for a decade, costing thousands of lives and draining the economy. Under glasnost, the truth about the war's failures became public, fueling anti-war sentiment. In 1986, the Chernobyl disaster exposed the government's incompetence and secrecy. Authorities tried to hide the scale of the nuclear accident, endangering millions. When the truth emerged, public outrage exploded. Chernobyl became a symbol of the government's failure to protect its people. Environmental and nationalist movements grew stronger, demanding change. The government's credibility was shattered. Gorbachev's reforms weakened Soviet control over Eastern Europe. He announced the USSR would no longer use force to keep communist regimes in power, the Sinatra Doctrine. In 1989, communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed, inspired by mass protests and free elections. The fall of the Berlin Wall became a symbol of freedom and the end of the Cold War divide. These events inspired nationalist movements within the USSR's own republics. The Baltic states led the way, demanding independence. Lithuania declared independence in 1990, soon followed by others. The Soviet Empire was fracturing along old national lines. The central government in Moscow was powerless to stop it. The dominoes were falling inside the USSR itself. By summer 1991, the USSR was on the brink. Hardline communists, fearing the loss of their power, staged a coup against Gorbachev in August. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and the coup leaders declared a state of emergency. But the people, emboldened by years of glasnost, resisted. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Republic, became the face of the resistance, famously standing on a tank and calling for defiance. Crowds built barricades and soldiers refused to fire on civilians. The coup collapsed after 3 days, its leaders arrested. Gorbachev returned, but his authority was gone. Power shifted to Yeltsin and the republics. The failed coup destroyed the last vestiges of central control. The Soviet Union's end was now inevitable. The final act was about to begin. After the failed coup, the Soviet republics moved quickly to declare independence. Gorbachev tried to save the Union, but the momentum was unstoppable. In December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met and agreed to dissolve the USSR, forming the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev, left powerless, resigned on December 25th. He handed over the nuclear codes to Yeltsin. That night, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. The world watched as a superpower vanished peacefully. The collapse was complete. An empire ended not by war, but by political decisions and the will of its people. The Soviet Union was gone. A new era had begun. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 unleashed a wave of chaos and uncertainty across its former republics. For millions, the world they had known vanished almost overnight, replaced by confusion and hardship. The sudden and unplanned shift from a centrally planned economy to capitalism triggered a severe economic shock. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, prices soared, and many found themselves unable to afford even basic necessities. Long lines formed at banks and stores while the value of the ruble plummeted, leaving families desperate. As state assets were rapidly privatized, a small group of oligarchs amassed vast fortunes, buying up entire industries for a fraction of their value. Meanwhile, millions lost their jobs as factories closed and social safety nets disappeared, plunging many into poverty and uncertainty. The power vacuum also fueled ethnic and regional conflicts. Wars erupted in places like Chechnya and Nagorno-Karabakh, displacing thousands and deepening instability across the region. The promise of democracy and reform was quickly overshadowed by daily struggles for survival. Protests erupted as people demanded change, but for many, the new freedoms came with a heavy price: uncertainty, crime, and a loss of security. On the world stage, the end of the USSR marked the close of the Cold War. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, and hopes for a new era of peace and cooperation briefly flourished. Former Soviet bloc countries, eager to secure their independence, moved quickly to join NATO and the European Union. These new alliances redrew the map of Europe and shifted the balance of power, setting the stage for new geopolitical tensions. Today, the legacy of the USSR remains hotly debated. Some look back with nostalgia, remembering the stability and sense of purpose, while others celebrate the freedoms and opportunities that emerged after its fall. The fall of the Soviet Union reshaped not only Russia, but the entire world. Its influence continues to shape politics, society, and identity in Russia and its neighbors, echoing through the decades. The story of the Soviet Union's rise and fall is a powerful lesson in the impact of ideas, the importance of leadership, and the enduring human desire for freedom and dignity, a story that still resonates today.